And welcome to the Prescribing Prosperity Podcast with John and Alec Soutsos. Gentlemen, part 2 with Dr. Bob Murphy is on the table for today. I was riveted by that conversation, and I'm sure that a lot of other people have come back here to hear part 2 of your conversation with Bob. And for those of you who missed it, don't go anywhere. You can listen to part 2 and go back and catch up on part 1 right after this. So stick around, listen to this part of the conversation. You don't need the prequel. You'll understand it. So John and Alex, it's good to be back with you, and I'm excited for part 2.
Thank you, Bill.
Absolutely.
We're looking forward to it.
So when we left off, for those who weren't listening, we had arrived at the Great Depression. And as many Americans who might be listening to this podcast, and a great number of Canadians as well, they probably think the cause of the Great Depression was Smoot-Hawley and tariffs. And I bring that up because tariffs are tremendously current and active at the moment. No. And then President Donald Trump in America is using that word a lot, and it's getting thrown around a lot. And there's a lot of stuff being written in the American press about tariffs. And honestly, I don't think a lot of people understand, A, what tariffs are, and they don't understand, B, what they're writing about. But I'm going to leave that up for you to talk about. So, Alex, without further ado, let me turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you again to Dr. Bob Murphy here for joining us for another episode. So, Bob, we left it off, as Bill alluded to, at the market crash in 1929. Mm-hmm. So, did the market crash actually cause the Great Depression?
So it's an interesting question. So as those, and again, folks, we'll try to, not assume everyone's listened to part 1 already, but part of how we started the last discussion was to go through and say, yeah, there were recurring financial panics in U.S. history in the late 1800s, or, famous one in 1907, before the Fed was there. But as I said, with those ones, typically what would happen is there would be a panic, there'd be a crash, but the market would find bottom within 12 to 18 months, and then there would be a solid recovery. Also, I should just mention, some people might say, no, I mean, if you go and look, there's long, these things are long dates that, this one panic or recession lasted for plenty of years and so on. Modern economists are revising some of that, because what would happen is if prices fell, then people thought like, oh, there must be a bad economy, because nowadays, especially after the Great Depression, we tend to associate deflation with a bad economy. Mm-hmm. But actually, no, as long as prices and wages come down and then things readjust, unemployment can come down. You can have a healthy economy, just prices are lower than in the original trajectory. So people have revised. And so that's partly what I'm saying, is that you didn't have this long drawn out stagnation. And so as far as that pattern, I argue in my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and New Deal. Also, if people Google my name, you can find I've given plenty of presentations like this that are on YouTube if you want to see like an hour-long version of me going through charts and whatnot. My claim is that, yes, the Fed helped fuel another boom-bust cycle in that same tradition. It was more extreme, because now you had the power of the central bank adding gasoline to the fire, like on the upswing. But had the federal government just stayed back and done nothing the way it had, all throughout U.S. history, then yeah, I think the popping of the stock bubble in 29, there would have been a panic, there would have been a depression with a small d, right? They would have called it, just like there was the depression of 1920 to 21. Mm-hmm. And then there was the roaring 20s. And so the question is, why was there a crash in 29? And how come we now refer to the entire 30s as the Great Depression? What happened? What was different? So it was not the boom bust cycle that was different. That had happened before. It wasn't the stock market crashing. That had happened before. And I argue, ironically, especially people who grew up in the United States and learned a version of history that what I'm going to say is going to surprise them. I argue in my book that the fundamental change was the Hoover administration came in and tried to, quote, fight the Depression. Right. And that was the thing that really was different. And that's partly why things got so bad. And then, of course, FDR comes in. He's elected in 32, sworn in 33. And he brings in what's called the New Deal, which just made things worse. And so that's what I argue in the book, that there would have been a crash and a depression with a small d, but what turned that into the Great Depression that lasted a decade was the combination of Herbert Hoover and then even more so FDR's policies that just made the thing last and last.
So to go back and just before we get into Herbert Hoover as his administration, one of the things that I was taught when I was in school was, it was corporate greed, it was unfettered capitalism, it was the overextension of consumer credit. They throw out a lot of, it's basically throwing stuff against the wall.
Margin buying on stocks. Yeah, that was one that I learned. There was no SEC at the time. There's no curbs. People could just borrow money to go buy stocks. And as long as the market's going up, that's fine. But if it comes down, there's a margin call, and then that caused a snowball effect.
But again, like you said, if you just have the free market mechanism, there's a reset that basically happens when the market crashes, and all those people are bounced from the market, and the financial institutions that lend to them are bounced from the market essentially because they've made poor lending choices, and so that would automatically correct itself as opposed to having a third party step in and provide those legislated countermeasures.
But Bob, you're not saying that those things didn't play a role, but the cause of those things, the expansion of credit, whether it's through margin lending, it had to do with the fact that the central bank was allowing the inflation of the credit in the system, and of course, you also had great, at that time, technological innovation with washing machines and cars and the demand to buy those things. So credit was being extended, but that credit originated with the central bank. Is that accurate?
So I yes, everything you just said I agree with, but I think I can make a stronger case rhetorically, for your listeners that, oh, come on, are you just this apologist for big business stuff? That all the things Alex just said, maybe not the margin calls, that may have been an innovation, but in terms of, it was the lack of regulatory oversight. This was just the wildcat, Wild West. There was no SEC, no right. All of that was also true in every prior panic. And so if we're trying to explain why was it that the crash in 29 led to the Great Depression, you can't point to things that were also true for every previous one. That'd be like if a plane crashes and you say, what happened? You say, gravity. I mean, yeah, that's part of the story, but obviously that's not explaining why did that plane crash, but 99.9% of the other ones, don't crash. Yes, didn't crash yesterday, right? So yes, the particular mechanisms, and if you're going to just give, an organic, minute description, play by play as to what happened in that history of that era, all those things would come into play to be sure. But again, it can't be because there was no SEC, because there was no SEC before that too, right? So that's kind of what I'm getting at. That there's got to be something more. The thing that is qualitatively, like you're saying, John, one is the Fed was there, whereas in previous ones there was, but there was the Fed in 1920 and 21, so it can't just be that. And so, what's interesting even there, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, that I'll just plant the seed now, and then Alex, you can have us elaborate when you think it's appropriate. But how the Fed responded in 20 and 21 was qualitatively different from what they did after the 29 crash, and so there's that element. But again, the huge thing is the Hoover administration, contrary to what everyone's been taught, the Hoover administration was the most interventionist, presidential administration in peacetime U.S. history to that point. So that's one thing that changed, and that's where you could go look to see, did that have something to do with it? And, as a standard economist, I can give you lots of examples as to, yes, that would help explain what happened.
Okay. So then just as the lead into the Hoover administration, and I'm glad you said that, because actually I remember one of the things that was frequently discussed during if anybody's ever watched the America's Presidents on the History Channel, they have a big long documentary series where they cover all the presidents. One of the things that they talked about with Hoover was that he was a laissez-faire president, and he didn't do enough during the Great Depression to bring about its end. And it's great to hear you say that was not the case. But let's talk a little bit the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act as a way to lead into him.
Before we get into that, just sorry for the interruption. There are people in the audience who may not understand the term laissez-faire. So it's a French term. It means keep your hands off or let it be. And essentially, it's an economy that's allowed to function without intervention by other parties like the government. Sorry, Alexander, carry on.
Okay, no, it's fine. So I was just going to say,
thanks for doing it. Yeah, I don't want to be talking inside baseball.
Yeah. So anyway, so I'll let you take it over, Bob, in talking about the Tariff Act, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, as well as the general application of the Hoover administration to the fallout from the financial market crash in 1929.
Okay, sure. So, as Bill said in the introduction to this discussion, yes, the people have been talking about Smoot-Hawley lately. By the way, just as a joke for those who appreciate U.S. politics, one thing I say is say what you will about Donald Trump, but at least he's gotten progressive Democrats to be in favor of free trade, right? In other words, it was never the case that somebody like a Nancy Pelosi, let alone like an AOC or something, would have been all about, oh, well, tariffs are taxes, and we all know taxes are bad, and we want to go ahead and have goods cross. But no, they were against, free trade. They would have said, oh, that's outsourcing U.S. jobs, and that's going to hurt union workers. That would have been their line, back when the Republicans were typically free trade.
There's video of Nancy Pelosi arguing that point in Congress in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And then she's turned around and now she's talking out of the other side of her mouth. But anyway.
Right. So, many ironies today as a result of the current president.
Yes. So in that context, then, because Donald Trump has been coming out, his administration's pro-tariff, and then he's even been giving history lessons from the stump speeches he's given about, oh yeah, back in, the late 1800s, the U.S. government relied primarily on tariff revenue and to fund it, which is also like excise taxes on liquor and stuff like that. But yeah, he's making true statements, and everything he said narrowly is correct. I think his point is, oh, when you when you raise revenue through tariffs, it doesn't hurt Americans because it's just those foreigners paying. I don't think that's accurate economically, but put that aside. One of the pushbacks people gave in terms of, oh, well, you got your history, we got our history, is they'll say, oh, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, people might remember that, Ben Stiller in Ferris Bueller's Day Off was calling it, Bueller, anybody, that mm-hmm. Hawley, he called it the Hawley Smoot tariff in the movie. Yeah. Right. But that's what we're talking about. So that was an act that was passed in 1930. And so again, the stock market crashes in 29. The depression is in full swing in 1930, and then things are absolute rock bottom in 1932. The U.S. unemployment rate's 25%. All right, so in terms of, it's just a steep slide, and an absolute awfulness is in 32, and then things turn around a little bit, and then there's actually another crash in like 37, 38. So a lot of people just colloquially you think of the entire 30s as the Great Depression, but in terms of the economic statistics, it's more that there was a bad contraction from 29 to 33, a recovery, and then another crash from, I think, 37 to 38 is how they clock it, just for what that's worth. But anyway, the Smoot-Hawley tariff being passed in 1930. So if you want to come up with and say, oh, what makes the economy fall into the depression, it was unprecedented, right? In terms of like how much they jacked up tariff rates. So it was a very large tax hike in terms of the percentages. And it is also true, if you look at statistics, that global trade flows shrank. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but constricted greatly after the passage of that. And so it's natural to say, oh, look, economists generally are in favor of free trade. They jacked up taxes in 1930 on imports, and trade flows shriveled up. And then look at unemployment kept going up. The economy kept cratering. Clearly, tariffs caused a great depression. And I even in my book said, even though I'm a free trade kind of guy in general, I don't like taxes, period. I think they distort things. But in my book came out way before, Trump was in office. So before this political controversy, I said, even though, I wouldn't have endorsed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, I don't think that explains things. Because one of the things we're going to get into at some point, I'm sure, Alex, is the money supply shrank. And so that's partly why just total spending collapsed in the U.S. and across the world. And so because of that deflation of the money supply. And so, the official trade flows, even if there weren't the Smoot-Hawley tariff, those would have gone down. The Great Depression was underway. So just in general, people don't import as much, when the economy's cratering, people don't spend, period. Right. So it's hard to disentangle and say how much of that is due to the Smoot-Hawley tariff versus just trade flows would have cratered anyway. Right. So that's kind of what I would say about that particular thing, that the Smoot-Hawley tariff, I don't think helped, certainly, but in terms of did that cause the Great Depression? No, I think that's crazy.
And if anything, it runs contrary to the current narrative that tariffs are inflationary because tariffs, as you noted, are taxes, and taxes are in fact the opposite. They're contractionary. They create a friction in the economy, so the circulation of money diminishes.
Yeah,
correct?
right.
Yeah.
Right. And also too, in general, if the money stock stays the same, just you know, in general, just because prices are like, for example, if the price of crude oil globally goes up, that doesn't mean that CPI inflation has to go. It just means, if gasoline gets more expensive, consumers still have the same amount of money.
They just spend it less on other things.
They spend on it less. So there's, you know what I mean? Again, you can get hyper technical, but I'm just saying as a general principle.
This is basic economics.
Right.
Inflation is a function of money supply, has nothing to do with tariffs. And yet the mainstream media has been telling us for the last 6 months that tariffs cause inflation.
Right. And again, as you said, to me, that's whereas if they wanted to raise the capital gains tax or something, nobody would be warning, that's going to be inflationary and hurt consumers at the nobody would say that. Right. None of the leftists. They would say, raise the capital gains tax.
Yeah, right.
So that's all true. So I do think of all this stuff in the last few years of people being anti-tariff and giving it is because they don't like Trump and he happens to be pro-tariff.
All right.
So let's go back to then, focusing on the Hoover administration and what exactly did the Hoover administration do that helped exacerbate the issues that started in the 1920 crash and then continued into the 1930s.
Okay, so here let me just mention two things. So in Hoover's memoirs, after the fact, he, as you can imagine, when he's talking about this period, he tries to make a point to tell the reader that, hey, I got a bad rap, And so partly what he did, because for people who don't know, like U.S. history, people referred to Hoovervilles, where there were just big camps of people who were, nowadays we'd call them homeless. Just people they got evicted from their places, they couldn't find work, and they just kind of congregated.
Hoover flags were pockets pulled inside out because they didn't have any money in them.
Yes, right. So, and in the 32 campaign, the 1932 presidential campaign, when Franklin Roosevelt's the Democrat running against Herbert Hoover, who's the incumbent trying to get reelected, the Roosevelt campaign painted Hoover as this do-nothing, laissez-faire, just, that's not the proper role of government kind of guy. And so that's what fueled this narrative. And then, the U.S. establishment loves Franklin Roosevelt. And so it kind of fits in that they would run with that and paint Roosevelt as the guy who rescued us from the Great Depression, whereas Hoover, this cruel, heartless tool of big business, sat back and did nothing. Mm-hmm. So just everything about that story is crazy, right?
So wait, Bob, let me just understand this. Are you saying that politicians lied in the old days just like they do today?
I am saying that, yes.
Okay.
So what's funny is Herbert Hoover in his memoirs, when he's later, and he went on to be a statesman and and he was kind of he restored his credibility in the eyes of the establishment, whatever.
Like Jimmy Carter.
Yeah. Yes. So he's explaining and saying there's two things I just want to hit. One is he said, this is an unfair allegation. It's true. I thought I wanted to be constitutional. And so he's saying that, it wasn't that he just thought you could do anything, that he thought, he wanted to respect the Constitution, but he still said, look at all the stuff we did. Right. And there was all sorts of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And so there are a lot of things that people would have thought happened under the New Deal that actually were the Hoover administration. I just jotted down from fiscal year 1930 to 32. So, that's a 2-year stretch. Total federal spending went up 42%. And this is a period when prices are collapsing. So that's a huge increase in real terms. In fiscal year 1933, the budget deficit was 4.5% of GDP. Right. So that's not, that's not enormous by our standards nowadays, but
that's still quite significant
for peacetime. That was so again, and so Keynesians nowadays, like someone like a Paul Krugman or something, will look at that and say, oh, it was too little, too late. But again, kind of going back to John and Alex, what you were asking, if we're trying to explain why did this crisis turn into the Great Depression when other ones hit, you can't say, oh, well, he only ran a budget deficit of 4.5% of GDP. When in earlier ones, they were running budget surpluses. The government was cutting, you know what I mean? So it doesn't make sense. What was different about it? Can't be that Herbert Hoover was too tight-fisted when he was the loosest fisted president in U.S. history at peacetime up to that point, if you get what I'm saying. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So anyway, so there's that element, and Hoover's going through. And so I don't think he's lying. Like, in other words, I think Hoover, in terms of what the reader and what he was thinking, to say, no, I did everything I could to, help the economy. So he's not lying there. I think it's correct. And just
he arguably did too much.
That's my point, is that I would say the things he thought he was doing to help actually were hurting. Is he had the wrong philosophy, right? And then the other one that people grab onto a lot, that again is just this distortion of the record, is to prove what a good guy he was, and why, as Hoover says, now it's true, when the stock market crash first happened, my Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon came to me and he recommended just hands off liquidation. He said, liquidate stocks, liquidate real estate, whatever like that. And so a lot of modern Keynesians, like back during the 2008 crisis, or whatever, and when some Republicans were, hey, let's not get carried away, they would say, oh, you don't want to make the same mistake as Herbert Hoover, whose philosophy, according to his Treasury Secretary, was to liquidate stocks, right? And what's crazy about that is, on the next page, Hoover goes on to say, I rejected his advice, right? So Hoover is quoting Mellon to say, I didn't do that, so don't get mad at me. And yet some people quote that as if that's what Hoover's official policy was. So that's just a distortion. But anyway,
so you're saying people of today are engaging in revisionist history? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I am.
Just to get that record straight.
Yeah. So in terms of, so again, another thing they did is, it is true, when they were running those big budget deficits to try to fix things, and then it didn't work. And I would, like you're saying, John, I would argue that made it worse. That I'm saying, no, government deficit spending doesn't help the economy, so that you're just channeling resources into political ends. But they did, going into 32, because the deficit was growing so big, they didn't just cut spending, they cut it a little bit, but they jacked up taxes to try to shore up the government's finances. So the top income tax bracket, remember, it had been cut during the Coolidge years under Mellon's advice from the really high World War I levels. And that, I would say, that's partly what fueled, the roaring 20s. So in 1 year, the federal income tax top rate went from 25% to 63%. This is already when we're in the depths of the Great Depression. So in terms of,
was Herbert Hoover more money away from the public?
Was Herbert Hoover a laissez-faire guy? Well, raising the top income tax rate from 25% to 63% in 1 year, when you're already in the worst economy in U.S. history, say what you will, but that's not laissez-faire capitalism. Like, that's crazy. So
this is a Republican president who believed in government intervention, followed by a Democrat president who believed in government intervention.
Right. And on that point, it was one of FDR's lieutenants, or whatever you want to call him, in the New Deal. Later on, I think it was in 1938, he said something like, we never would have admitted it at the time, but just about everything we did in the New Deal when we first came into power was just an extension of what Hoover had started in his administration, right? So again,
just rebranded, essentially.
Yeah, right. And more so, they extended it. So the big thing, though, if people are, okay, he jacked up taxes, he raised spending and deficit. Okay, but what, to me, the single critical mistake, in terms of, you can't just pick one, is that prices were falling. All right. And so the money supply, you remember, we talked before in the prior episode about how, because commercial banks can, in a sense, expand the money supply, that, you put $1,000 in the bank, if they make a $900 loan to somebody else, there's a sense in which now the money supply is $1,900, right? Because you still think that $1,000's yours.
Right.
It's still in my checking account. If I go and check my balance, it's $1,000, and yet now someone gets a loan for $900. They think they have $900, so there's like $1,900. So when you understand how that works, it also goes in reverse. If there's a panic and people go to the banks and pull their money out, well, then the broader measures of the money supply shrink.
Collapse.
And so from 29 to 33, the U.S. M1 money stock fell by like a third because of that mechanism. People just panicking and pulling their money out of banks. It wasn't just that, an individual bank goes down. It's that when they're calling in their loan, either calling in the loans or just, writing them off, but it shrinks the money supply.
So that's, Bob, sorry to interrupt you, just a little bit of perspective here. And this is something I've mentioned to people, and historically, more people lost money in banks, having their money in banks, than they did in stocks.
Yeah.
Because the majority of people, as a percentage of the population, who own stocks and as a significant asset in their financial profile, was much less than the number of people with money in bank accounts. And so as banks were going under, or there were runs, people lost a ton of money having their money in banks.
Right.
So this is another mistake of historical perspective, is thinking that you should never invest in stocks. You should always have your money in the bank if you want safety, when in fact, really, there's no such thing as total safety, but everything depends on what the circumstances are. It's not so cut and dry.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought. At first, I thought you just meant percentage terms, but yeah, especially when you consider because also too, for people who don't, back then, money held its purchasing power. So like if you just literally put money under a mattress, that wouldn't have been as crazy to do back then as it is now. And so it wasn't that people, quote, had to be in the market in order to keep pace with inflation back then. So
today I come across clients who say, I want stability of my capital, and I think I should be in bank deposits or bonds. But you have a systemic attack on your purchasing power through the expansion of the money supply at a rate of 2%, 2.5% every year. So in fact, you're losing money by leaving your money in bank deposits or government bonds. Correct?
Right. Yes. And like you say, it's not like they're bedrock stable too. Like, oh yeah, my money's in the bank. Like it's kind of an expression when, okay. So yeah, there is that element. So again, and I'm sure Alex, maybe you want to, at some point we'll talk more about that, but just to state that fact that the money supply shrank from 29 to 33 by about a third. So of course prices are falling. And so, and that happened all the time in prior panics or crises or depressions with a small d. The price in the 1920-21 depression, prices fell a bunch in 1 year, but wage rates fell even more. And so that's why there was a spike in unemployment, and then it subsided and workers could find work. The thing that to me was the catastrophic mistake that the Hoover administration made, among the other bad things they did, was right when the 29 crash happens, Hoover calls all of the big labor unions and business leaders to Washington, and he tells them, as it's clear they're going to enter, into a bad economy, and they know from history else that probably prices are going to start falling. Hoover subscribed to this theory that said, what happens during a business crisis is that, something happens, there's a panic, people clam up, they stop spending, and so business revenues, fall. And then the businesses in turn also panic. And so they, start laying off workers or cutting their pay. And he says, but then that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because now the workers don't get paid as much, so they can't go buy products. And so now and so he just thought it was this downward spiral that just once it got going, it was just going to keep going. And there was like no real reason for it. It was just this, thing. And so he urged all the big business leaders and the labor unions to keep wage rates, in money terms, constant. And that's how we'll nip this thing in the bud, because the workers will still have strong purchasing power. They can afford to buy the product, that kind of mentality. And so that was just, in my mind, a bad theory he had as to what causes depressions, because then they actually listened to it. And it wasn't just because of the eloquence of his words. Like he had ways of kind of get carrots and sticks.
Incentivizing, yes.
Yeah, of incentivizing that. But whatever way he achieved it, the data is incontrovertible that wage rates did not fall nearly as much, during the years of the Great Depression as they did from 1920 to 21. So people say, wages are sticky, but it's not like a law of nature. It's not like the charge on an electron. Wages weren't so sticky in 1920, 21. And they were when the president of the U.S. is having this organized effort to say, keep wage rates up.
Yeah.
So if you want to call that sticky wages, okay. But so if you think about that 1-2 punch, that the money stock falls by a third and businesses aren't allowed to cut hourly wage rates. And so every year, as prices in general are falling, labor is becoming more and more expensive in real terms.
Right.
And so we're trying to understand, why did unemployment go up to 25%? Partly it's because it kept getting more expensive to hire workers, right, when the economy's crashing. So yeah, so that to me, that was like the single worst mistake he made in terms of, you know, the optics of why can't people find work.
And so what year was the tax hike from 25 to 63%?
I think that was in 32.
32. Okay. So then what were some of the other catalysts that shrank the money supply during that time? So obviously we have the disappearance of people's capital, or a certain portion of it, during the market crash. We have the increasing of the tax rates. What other money supply constraints existed?
There were a bunch of bank runs. So thousands of banks in the U.S. fell. And actually, since I know a lot of your audience is Canadian, this might be interesting. Again, when you're trying to explain, well, geez, why did thousands of banks in the U.S. fail? A lot of the explanation, a lot of the reasons people will give were also true in Canada. And yet in Canada, you didn't have massive bank failures.
Right.
And so it can't just be like, well, the global economy was awful. Well, it was bad for Canada too. Or or there are crop failures, and that's why, and so you can explain specific little things, but in terms of the general pattern,
right.
And so a huge thing that a lot of free market economists point to in terms of policy and regulation differences between the U.S. and Canada is that in the U.S. they had prohibitions on what's called branch banking.
Right.
And particularly you couldn't do it over state lines. So the idea was, one private company that owns banks and they're doing business in Michigan, they can only make loans to people in Michigan.
Right.
Right. And so whereas if you allow branch banking where one company can, have branches all over the country, then if there's just a sectoral thing, like a bunch of farmers go under and fall behind on their mortgage payments, just because crop prices fall, it's not that the bank goes down because, our loans all from that sector are underperforming, but we're diversified. We have all sorts of loans on the books, and so we're fine. And that's what happened in Canada. That there were pockets of problems, but because the Canadian banks were countrywide,
right?
They were able to weather the storm. So there's elements like that, and then there were also these problems all kind of fed on each other. So then, when certain states, they had banks that, let's say, were tied to mortgages on farms. And then when crop prices are falling for, the reasons we're saying, then those mortgages start failing and people get worried about those banks. They run on those banks, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and they crash.
You keep pulling and pulling and pulling on the thread, and then there's more money that's been drawn out of the economy.
And then what happened is the state so George Selgin is the guy who, has written this stuff up, and I encourage people to check out his work, Selgin. So he makes the case and kind of just shows the chronology of it in terms of, normally when people tell the story, it's just like, oh yeah, people panicked and they go to take their money out of the banks and all the banks go down. And he said, no, it wasn't that generic. Mm-hmm. It was the banks that were prone to the runs were the ones that had actually made bad investments. In other words, it wasn't just the public was just, oh, I don't like banks. It was, no, I have specific reason to fear my money being in this particular bank.
I don't trust them.
Yeah. And so, and then what happened though is the reason the government regulators added fuel to the fire is, in certain, and I apologize, off the top of my head, I don't remember the sequence of which states it were, but the banks in one state started getting attacked, having runs, and then the regulators in that state closed the banks, like had a bank holiday just at the state level to say, whoa, we don't want all the banks to fail. You can't take your money out. Let's just take a breather here and let's rethink this. And then that made people in other states wonder,
panic more.
Are they going to do that to my bank? You know what I mean? Because if your money's in the bank, you need it. It's not just like, oh, well, there's a bank holiday, so I guess I don't have to pay my bills for 3 months. Like, no, that's partly why
my mortgage doesn't have to be paid.
We saw this scenario unfold in 2011 during the collapse of the Greek economy and the Greek banking system, right? Would you agree that was an equivalency?
Yeah, for sure. For this piece of that similarity, for sure. And so it was ironically, it was not, again, people point to, it's laissez-faire capitalism. No, in this case, it was the government intervening that helped fuel, the problem that people started running on even healthy banks, not because they had some doubt about, their loan portfolio, but just because they realized, for all I know, the regulators are going to try to get ahead of the curve and shut down our banks. So I want to get my money out now. I want to have it in cash, not sitting in a bank that might be closed for a month. And so then it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy that just kept happening.
Right.
So things like that.
And then we get a new president. The United States gets a new president. Franklin Roosevelt, and he does what?
Right. So one of the early things. So again, that's the 32. November 32 is when the election is. He comes in. Back then, they didn't swear in the new president until March, right? So now they do it in January, but back then they did it in March. So Roosevelt doesn't even really get into office until March. And then one of the first things he does is declare the banking holiday, shuts down all the banks. And there's a lot of work on this too to show they, very quickly, the banks were not shut down for very long, and they very quickly reopened most of them. And there are people showing, like, just running the numbers, there's no way that regulators went and inspected all the records of each, you know what I mean? It was just more of a restoring confidence kind of thing. And like, okay, the adults are in charge now. Everybody take a deep breath. The banks are fine, kind of a thing that they couldn't have possibly have inspected the books and signed off on them with the amount of paperwork they would have had to process. So that's, famously what happened. And then also he takes the dollar off gold. So in terms of both critics and fans of what he did there would say partly what happened, like, why is it that it kind of ended the crisis and got the U.S. to be growing again, that, officially the U.S., the contraction ended in 33, and then, that we had a rapid recovery in terms of real GDP and stuff like that for a few years, until the so-called double dip of 37, 38 is, among other things, they just pumped in, they inflated, right? So the money supply had been contracting. And so then by, among other things, taking the dollar off gold. So it went from originally, when FDR suspends the dollar, it was at $20.67 for an ounce of gold. And then a year later, it was $35 for an ounce of gold. So if in terms of the devaluation of the dollar, that they're effectively like freeing up the Fed's ability to pump in money and, to make things appear to be growing again.
Right. Okay. So we get to, obviously the Fed has then started to inject some capital into the economy at that point. What is truly the catalyst that helps us exit from the Great Depression?
Well, sorry to interrupt. Before we get to that, there is also this process of cartelization of businesses throughout the 1930s by FDR. Can you elaborate on that, Bob?
Sure. So yeah, a big, it's not even an unintended consequence. It's like literally the ostensible aim of New Deal policies was to restrict supply, right? And I mean, it's to the point where it's funny in I don't know if it's as big in Canada, but in the U.S., John Steinbeck is one of our revered writers, and he's got The Grapes of Wrath as probably his most famous book. And in there, which is the plight, featuring the plight of Americans in the 1930s, and in there's a scene where Steinbeck, who's ostensibly trying to showcase the absurdities of market capitalism, it's that there's a bunch of hungry people. And there's this pile of oranges that, like the farmers, they harvest a crop of oranges and they have them just sitting there. And there's these starving people because they can't find work and they just want to go eat what's going to be thrown out. And then the owners, like they put gasoline on the oranges, like to make them inedible. And the reason is because, like, oh, well, if people can just eat the oranges for free, they're not going to go buy them. And the whole point was to restrict output to raise crop prices. Okay,
right.
So what's interesting about it? So again, if you're reading Steinbeck's treatment, it's like, yeah, that's capitalism for you, that they're literally destroying food while people are starving, such as the profit motive. When no, if you just think about it, under pure capitalism, if you're an individual orange grower, you don't have control of the entire market stock. It would be crazy for you to destroy some of your specific little output, your harvest, to try to raise prices for all your competitors while they still sell their whole, nobody ever does that under decentralized capitalism. What happened is the federal government under the Roosevelt administration ordered farmers to destroy crops and to, overturn their land. So
not just destroy crops, destroy chickens.
Yes.
Pigs, cows, milk, eggs. They destroyed the very thing that people desired most, which was food.
Yep.
But in support of the producers over the consumers, the government ordered the destruction of any excess production of these things. And this is exactly what we have today in Canada with the supply management system of our dairy, eggs, and poultry, is it not?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I'm obviously not an expert on Canadian policies, but
that's what supply management is all about, right?
I have had people explain to me stuff like, the cheese imports and things, like how crazy it is in terms of the
supply management is designed to protect producers and ultimately punish consumers.
Yeah. So so just for the listeners to understand, of course, the way FDR, the administration built it and the various New Deal programs they had for these sorts of things, they didn't sell it as, hey, you know what? We think the way to help starving people is to destroy food. That's not what they said. Instead, what they said is, part of the reason we have such a bad economy right now is this disastrous race to the bottom of collapsing prices. And so farmers are, the family farm is getting taken over by the bank because farmers can't make their mortgage payments when crop prices are down and stuff like that. And so we need to boost farm income by raising the price of their product. Like that's the way they explained it. They didn't say we're going to go destroy food and that's the way we're going to help you Americans. But it wasn't even just agriculture, as you know. I'm guessing, John, that every trade association, was in the National Labor Relations Act, so it was brought under this legislation, and they had to have a register, and they would set codes of industry conduct that were, set by the market leaders, right? So like the company that, I think it was Firestone at the time, was the leader in making tires. They got to determine, this is like if you want to be able to sell tires, they got to fit these specifications, have this kind of a quality, and you have to sell it at this price. You can't undercut. And so that was the idea, that we can't be undercutting each other because it's a race to the bottom.
So basically government regulated the conduct between two voluntary parties entering into a business transaction. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely.
So if you're in the city and your coat needs to be mended, or there's 3 buttons missing, you walk to a tailor, and the tailor, because he's having financial difficulty, says, look, normally this is going to cost me $2 to do. I'll charge you $1. And then the government regulator would step in and say, no, you can't do it for $1.
Right.
They're going to intervene in that private transaction and say, you must do it for $2, even though the tailor is prepared to do it for less. And the person who's paying for it is prepared to pay that less.
Yep.
And another example of government intervention interfering with free market economics and distorting economic demand and supply and creating the problems, exacerbating the Great Depression.
Exactly. And just 2 anecdotes. So going back to the crop thing, so there's a funny thing of that, part of this. So for people who are confused, ultimately what they were trying to do, like they did things like they would pay farmers not to plant in certain, so there's the novel Catch-22 that some people may be familiar with. There's a funny thing in there where there was a guy who was on the government dole and he was just getting subsidies to not grow crops. And so it said something like, he would wake up at the crack of noon to get up and not plant anything, instead of the crack of dawn, So anyway, stuff like that, just to show the absurdities. And so the story, like there was mules, like normally that would drag, plows and stuff, and that under orders from the government, the farmers were trying to get them to overturn the crops and whatever, to ruin it. And that the mule, they didn't want to do it, because they just, they knew we're not supposed to do that. And so people were saying, so even the jackasses were wiser than the bureaucrats in this case. And then the other one, I have a quote in my book from John T. Flynn, who was, an observer on this, a journalist chronicling this stuff in real time, who was a huge critic of FDR. I'm not going to get the exact wording right, but he said something like, yes, in New York City, you would have fleets of jackbooted, I don't know if you use the word thug, but who would, kick in the doors of a tailor in the night and have him stand there and inspect his premises because he had committed the crime of sewing a pair of pants after hours. And so the point being, because among the things that the codes established is you only had set hours of day. Because again, the whole point was to restrict supply. Right. And so you can't have it that, well, if this tailor's willing, the customer needs a rush order and he's willing to work to 8 p.m., well, then that means all of us have to be willing to do that. And that's going to, lower price and raise the output. And so, no, we're trying to restrict supply. You can only work between, 9 and 6 or whatever.
So and just in the interest of time here, Bob, because we got to get out in the next 5 minutes, but can you just tell us, how did we exit? What was the catalyst for getting us out of the Depression?
Okay, great. Glad you were looking at the time. So we'd still be in 1934. So let me address the big elephant in the room. Of course, a lot of people say, "Oh, it was World War II. That's what got the U.S. out of." And let me just address that real quickly, and then I'll say what I think the real answer was. If that's what you think, and what's funny is there's a lot of right-wing Republican types who say, "Oh yeah, it wasn't the New Deal. It was World War II." So what's funny is maybe you're right, but then notice you're a Keynesian too. You're just saying, "Oh, the problem with FDR is he didn't spend enough on his domestic social programs. It took the even bigger deficit spending of the military to really pull us out." So again, maybe you think that's right, but you're still vindicating Keynes if you say that. That's not like a laissez-faire thing, where you're coming from. But on that point, so we're here, Robert Higgs, Higgs, is the economic historian that I think just shows why that explanation doesn't work. Among other things, they had price controls in place. All right. So the official real GDP statistics do seem to show prima facie that U.S. output started rising rapidly, after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S. enters the war, 41 through 45. It does look like year over year, total U.S. real output zooms up, but that's partly because the way real GDP is calculated, it looks at nominal expenditures and then divides by some price index, right? And so what was happening during that period is the Fed was creating boatloads of new money, so that was fueling the numerator, as it were, but it was illegal for prices to go up because they had price controls.
Right.
And so, you can make, real output go up if you print a bunch of money and then make it illegal to raise prices. And so he, just showed that they didn't account for that at all. It's not like they did an adjustment. He said, no, they literally ignored that. Other things too is if you look at just the consumer segment of total output, even according to the official statistics, it was lower in 1944 than at the height of the depths of the Great Depression. So in other words, the total amount of output going to U.S. consumers was lower right when the economy's booming, according to them, than it was like in 1932. And so it kind of just showing something screwy here. It's not like that was really a healthy economy on the home front. It was just the war, reset people's expectations, and they could deal with the privation because, there's a war on, as opposed to it's just, hey, the economy's not working. It's Herbert Hoover's fault. So the thing that I would say that actually does explain it is partly entering the war helped in the sense that the Roosevelt administration had earlier been at war with big business. Like Roosevelt, talking about the plutocrats and whatnot. They realized we need big business to be cranking out tanks and bombers and battleships. So the businessmen weren't as in fear that they were going to be expropriated. So I think that partly helped calm things and led to long-term investment and so on. And then the other thing was, I hate to say it, that just FDR dying and then a new administration, Truman taking over, I think reassured people. And then ultimately, you don't really see the big jump in private investment until 1946. So it was really the end, as the U.S. government withdrew its footprint from the U.S. economy, that's finally when things were somewhat back to normal.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Well, we could obviously go much further into this, and we'd love to have you back on if you'd be willing to, Dr. Murphy, to discuss this in even more depth, because there are more topics that we wanted to get into here today. So thank you for coming on, and if you'd be willing to, we'd love to have you on again someday.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah. Really great conversation. And Bob, I would invite you back, but it's not my podcast. So thanks for being on with John and Alex.
Look him up.
Oh, he's fantastic. And speaking of which, the book that you've been talking about, listeners, is The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression in the New Deal by Dr. Bob Murphy. Bob, what are the best places for anybody who wants to learn more about what you're talking about? Where can they go?
Follow me on Twitter at Bob Murphy Econ. And then if you go to my personal podcast, bobmurphyshow.com, that's where you can find my stuff. The more financial topics, if you go to infinio.ai, I'm the chief economist there.
Fantastic. John, Alex, what is the best place for people who don't know you, who want to learn more about you, to get a hold of you?
They can visit our website at medwealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca.
Fantastic. Viewers, if you are not a subscriber, I don't understand why you're not at this point, but if you're not, hit that follow button, become a subscriber, because then you're notified every time they drop a new episode of their podcast. The other thing I would ask is that if you like this podcast and you find it interesting, tell people about it. Word of mouth promotion from a person not some weird bot or thing you don't know what it is the most valuable thing out there in the world today, I believe. So thank you for recommending this podcast. On behalf of John and Alex and everybody at MedWealth, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen today. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.